The year is AD 74, and pretty much everyone in Judea is dead. After the huge Jewish revolt that broke out in the late 60s, there was widespread destruction in the area, but the Jewish religion still survived the slaughter. The Roman Empire was still on the rise, and the local Christians were now spreading all over the known world. The thing that had died, however, was the last semblance of Jewish independence. Prior to the revolt, even if the Romans were harsh as regarded taxation and military intervention, they were pragmatic. Often they let local rulers stay in place, as long as they subjected themselves to some of the Roman laws and taxation, in order to keep the local populace content. Because contrary to popular belief, wars and uprisings are bad for business. But when a war broke out anyways, afterwards the Romans decided that they had enough with all the Jewish unrest in the region, and they didn't expel the Jews as they would after the next great and last revolt in AD 133, but they did take away the Jewish right to govern themselves. And this was not just a huge letdown as far as Jewish national morale went, but this combined with the destruction of the temple led to the end of the Jewish aristocratic priesthood, or as you're probably familiar with them from the New Testament, the Sadducees. Today we'll be talking about the story and beliefs of this elusive group who, above all else, valued their own power, into the bitter end. This is the history of the Sadducees. If you have watched my video on the Pharisees, you'll know that even though the Pharisees are elusive, because they didn't leave any writings of their own, they're still pretty easy to figure out because they were so influential and so popular that history couldn't help but record them anyways. With the Sadducees, not so much. Both because there's less information since they weren't nearly as influential in the long term, but also because they are not a linear phenomenon in the same way as the Pharisees, who came from the scribes and became the rabbis. The Sadducees, on the other hand, kinda came from a bit of everywhere, with only some general things about them being the unifying factors. First, the main thing that characterized a Sadducee was that they were aristocrats. They were rich and influential people belonging to a small amount of families chiefly located in Jerusalem, and also they were kind of inbred. Josephus writes about them that they are able to persuade none but the rich and have not the populace with them. And when we say that the Sadducees were aristocrats, what we really mean is that they belonged to the high priests. From the time that the Jews had returned from their Babylonian exile, the country had been locally governed by the priesthood. Even though yes, they had kings and such over them in Persia and Greece for example, the local government was essentially a theocracy. To quote St. Luke in Acts, "But the high priest rose up, and all who were with him, that is, the party of the Sadducees, and filled with jealousy they arrested the apostles and put them in public prison." So the Sadducees were the ruling priests. Of course, if you've watched the video on the Pharisees, you will know that the Pharisees came from the scribes, but not all scribes were Pharisees. Just in that way, even though the Sadducees were from the priestly families, not all priests were Sadducees. Rather, as I mentioned before, the Sadducees were the ruling elite of the priests. Now, the Sadducees were not very popular with the people as far as their ideas and policies went, but this does not mean that they didn't have the support of the people in any sense. They were, as far as even their arch rivals the Pharisees were concerned, the legitimate high priests and were honored as such. The Pharisees, who were the ones who were effectively the writers of the law of the land due to their popularity with the people, even though they weren't priests themselves and they had a feud going on with the Sadducees, they interpreted the Jewish law very favorably for priests. Now that we know a little about who the Sadducees were, we can dive into where the group came from. And what better place to start than to ask why they are named the Sadducees? The name Sadducee comes from the Jewish name Zadok. So much like the group that came after Jesus Christ are called Christians, and those who came after Luther Lutherans, and those who follow the Pope Papists, so the Sadducees are named after Zadok. The difference is that we have no clue who Zadok is. But there are a couple of theories, one of which is more likely than the others. Probably the Zadok referred to is the Zadok named in 2 Samuel, who was high priest under David and Solomon. And as David and his son Solomon were remembered as the two great kings of Israel, naturally the high priest during this time would have his family name remembered as well, and this was Zadok. This is picked up by the book of the prophet Ezekiel, who, when describing the new temple, says that only the sons of Zadok will be allowed to minister there, as they are the ones who stayed loyal to God when all of Israel went astray. After the exile and the rebuilding of the second temple, the Zadokites did not in fact become the only priests at the temple, but they were still held in high esteem in people's minds. We can see this because the compiler or compilers of the Book of Chronicles traces the lineage of the Zadokites back to Eleazar, the oldest son of Aaron, Moses' brother, who you may know as the first priest of Israel. Therefore, it's not a stretch to assume that those most honored priests who had a special place soon formed a ruling elite, with their adherents being soon called the Zadokitians, or the Sadducees. And this explains why the Sadducees were also the aristocracy. So now we know who the Sadducees were and where they came from. But what made a Sadducee not only in name, but in belief and character? The first thing that separates the Sadducees from the other sects of their day, specifically the Pharisees and their many adherents, is that they did not recognize the oral Torah developed by the scribes as binding. The Sadducees are often misinterpreted as only holding the written Torah, as in the 5 books of Moses, as divine revelation, but this is probably wrong, and they probably held the most if not all the same books as the Pharisees did as canonical scripture. Josephus again writes that the Sadducees say that we are to esteem those observances which are written in the written word, but are not to observe what is derived from the tradition of our forefathers. So in this sense, they were a lot more conservative than the Pharisees, who wanted to make the Torah more relevant and living to the everyday Jew by expanding it into a case law that touched many parts of everyday life. This also caused some differences in how they applied the law. The Sadducees were often a lot harsher in how they punished offenders, which Josephus again testifies to, saying that in this regard they are above all the rest of the Jews. And this probably comes from the fact that since the Sadducees didn't try to expand the written law into a trillion different case studies, they took the letter of the law very seriously. Next up, for anyone who's familiar with this time period in Jewish history, something that was very important was the concept of ritual cleanliness, and this is the area which the Pharisees specialized in. To simplify, the oral Torah that they had developed had plenty of rules as to how the ordinary Jew should hold himself to be as ritually clean as possible, and ironically the Sadducees thought that all these cleanliness laws were rubbish. But at the same time, they did hold an even higher standard for cleanliness in certain ritual actions, like sacrifices in the temple. And all of this goes to show that the Pharisees and the Sadducees weren't so much different in principle as they were in practice. They both held that every part of Jewish life and the Torah were important, and neither discarded any part of it. The principle that differentiated the two groups, and thus the Sadducees and Jewish society as a whole, since the Pharisees held the populace with them, is only and entirely that the Sadducees rejected the developed tradition of the Pharisees and scribes as mandatory for Jewish life. To put it in a modern perspective, we can consider the Sadducees as the conservatives of Jewish society, and the Pharisees as the more progressive or liberal, keeping in mind of course that these are modern categories. This primarily showed itself not so much in the minutiae of ritual cleanliness or judicial punishment, but in the Sadducees' denial of the afterlife, which is picked up by our evangelists like Saint Mark, who writes that the Sadducees, who say that there is no resurrection, came to ask Jesus a question. And by Luke, when he writes that Saint Paul did a little trolling by starting an argument about the resurrection in the Sanhedrin between the Pharisees, who hold the same view as the Christians, and the Sadducees, who say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit. The reason for all of this, however, wasn't necessarily that the Sadducees simply disagreed with the Pharisees' conclusion regarding the Torah, but rather they had a different motive altogether. Remember, the Sadducees were aristocrats, which meant that they had significant amounts of political power and wealth, and they were very interested in keeping that power and wealth. They were, in other words, very worldly, and wished for their religion to support their worldliness. A big reason for this was probably the very tense situation in Judea. You had the Romans and the Sadducees, who liked the current situation in the country and who wanted nothing less than they wanted a massive revolt, and then you had the great mass of the Pharisees and the Jewish populace, who wanted nothing more than they wanted a massive revolt. A big reason for this was the eschatological, which by the way just means end times or final things of, views of the Pharisees, who believed that God would intervene to change the current order, and that when the Messiah was finished, the dead would all be raised. So if you're a Jew in the 1st century Judea, there is little stopping you if someone claims himself to be the Messiah here to throw out the Romans and restore Israel, because people who believe in an afterlife, especially a bodily resurrection, are a lot less likely to fear death. And whereas for Christians, this led to our great saints often being fearless in the face of martyrdom, for the Jews, it meant war. And if there was a war, the Sadducees knew, they'd probably find themselves a lot worse off than they were currently. So then, where did the Sadducees come from and where did they go? The start of Sadducean power came after the return from exile under the Persian period, about 500 years before Christ, but it grew especially during the Greek period that came after Alexander's conquest a couple of hundred years later. In this time, the high priest was the chief of state, and eminent priests were at the head of the Gerousia, the high council, which, for maybe the first time, made the priesthood just as political as it was religious. Combine this with the increasing place of Hellenism, Greek culture, in the region and even in Judea, and soon, if you wanted to get anywhere politically, you had to in one way or another become friendly with Hellenism. So soon, the priesthood at Jerusalem, those that would later be called the Sadducees, were alienated from the still Jewish population. So they were very friendly when Antiochus Epiphanes, the precursor to the literal Antichrist, started making demands of Judea to slowly but surely ban the Jewish religion. This was put to a relatively swift end with a civil war that saw Judea become quasi-independent, and the Hellenists were expelled or silenced. But the incentives that caused this in the first place were still there, however now with a populace that was firmly Jewish and wanted to remain so. And this saw the split in Jewish religious life that we still see in the days of the New Testament happen, between the worldly Sadducees, who have no popularity with the people, but all the power, and the at times fanatically religious Pharisees, who have all the popularity with the people, but little power. A couple of times this shifts back and forth, with the Pharisees gaining power under a couple of rulers, but for the most part this remains the case. The Sadducees had to listen to the Pharisees because otherwise the people would not tolerate them, but the Pharisees had to listen to the Sadducees because they were the ones wielding power. The end of the Sadducees came swiftly and decisively with the great Jewish revolt that started in 66 AD. The Sadducees, reading the room, sided with probably the revolt, since if they won, maybe they could retain some influence, but if they lost, the Romans were probably going to come after them for failing to keep the peace anyways. And lost they did. And with the loss, not only was the temple destroyed, but the Romans were a lot less willing to let the local Jews rule themselves. And as the Sadducees only existed for purposes of wielding political power, and had no footing in any other sphere of life, they disappeared almost overnight, and soon all but the faintest memory of them had faded. There are a couple of references to them in the New Testament and in Josephus, and in the later Mishnaic writings. But as they were relevant pretty much only to themselves, soon no one really knew who they were or who they had been, not even their arch-rivals, the Pharisees. The lesson here? If you're gonna be a grumpy apostate persecuting God's people, at least don't do it just for political reasons. Peace be with you all. Amen.